think I'm going to have to read this book during this session because I'm moving
Okay.
out of town, so it wouldn't make sense for me to...
We are live. Welcome to Boston Basic Income. I'm Alex Howlett. Our subject this week is the productivity paradox. So the issue is that technology is getting more and more advanced, but our productivity in terms of how much output, how much economic output we have per unit of labor, per hour of labor, is the growth of that is slowing down. So what's up with that? Some of us read an article from MIT Technology Review called The Productivity Paradox, and it's by David Rotman from last year. Usually I go around to get people's initial impressions, but I want to start with a quote from the article and then get people's impressions of this quote. Unfortunately, we don't have it up on the screen this time, but I'll read it for you guys. So this is the first quote. To become wealthier, a country needs strong growth in productivity, the output of goods or services from given inputs of labor and capital. For most people, in theory at least, higher productivity means the expectation of rising wages and abundant job opportunities. So how do we feel about that quote? Do we feel like it's accurate? Which parts do we agree with? And does anyone have anything to add? So we'll go around in a circle. We'll start with Roman.
I haven't read the article and I don't have any intelligent assessment or opinion about it.
Or general thoughts about the productivity paradox, if you have any.
Well, my thoughts relate to my focus on the error of our economies being based upon the need for incessant growth and how maybe this is going to put into focus whether we actually should base our economies on the idea that they always need to grow in order to be successful.
Yeah, okay. Steve?
Well, productivity can go up if some factory gets a lot of robots or machines and then requires fewer human workers, right?
Right.
So the part where the workers are all happy because productivity is going up only applies to the ones who keep their jobs. Okay.
I like what he said about the delayed effect of developing technologies. The fact that we can't really see the effect of the productivity yet, but that's because we haven't been able to yet assimilate AI and other technologies in a way that we can use them, that corporations can use them, for example.
Right.
So there's a lag thing. And I think there's he gives an example of that from another era, maybe the beginning of computer. Yeah, 1987. That's it. And
Right.
I was convinced by that pretty much.
Yeah.
That it's just a lag. That all this development and innovation is happening. It's just we haven't caught up with how to use it yet to make it part of the productivity.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Richard.
I just read an article today on Bloomberg that that our product, the amount of labor in the economy isn't 63% anymore. It's actually 56% now, and so that might explain some of it. And
In terms of the profits going to capital versus labor, is that what you mean?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Okay.
The labor participation, yes.
Oh, labor participation rate. Okay.
Mm-hmm. And it just went down 7% in the past few years. But we produce the same amount of stuff. So, and one of the reasons why wages aren't going up is because people are, like factory workers and things, are actually afraid to ask for a raise because they're afraid of having their job replaced, it said in the article.
Okay. So Bethany, we have this first quote that we started with. To become wealthier, a country needs strong growth in productivity, the output of goods or services from given inputs of labor and capital. For most people, in theory at least, Higher productivity means the expectation of rising wages and abundant job opportunities.
Oh, you love that part.
Yeah, so what do you think?
Yeah, that's interesting. Well, obviously, like, this is probably framed from the typical perspective of labor being a very constraining resource. But if you don't think that's the case, then it changes things a little bit. In the sense that, you know, you could be producing more stuff with less labor, but that still fits the first part of it, which has to do with more output per labor. And I do think that's important because we also care about people's time. And so if we're not getting more output per labor, then we're not helping people use their time better, which is kind of a part of prosperity. I guess one other factor is like the pleasantness or unpleasantness of the work. So I think one thing that we have seen, well, I don't know how people would debate this, but one thing you arguably have seen in the last 100 years is that even if people are working not quite as much, but somewhat as much, there might be moving towards more pleasant kinds of things. So that's also an aspect of prosperity, I think, that maybe isn't captured there.
Okay.
Or maybe that's a part of what they mean.
What about gig work?
Yeah, so I don't know, that's why I said it's a little debatable, but I'm trying to go back far enough, like 100 years or 150 years. Probably most of us would prefer the job we have now to like the job we would have had.
100 years ago, people had were doing things like baking and assembly line work and things like that.
Right.
They actually saw what they were doing and they were paid somewhat well. But now they work.
Maybe I
So,
need to go
and
back
like
farther. I'm trying to
gig
go
work.
back before like the labor movement. Pay was pretty low, danger was pretty high.
So like the 1870s.
Yeah, we can go back that far. I'm just trying to make the point about the quality of work is important. Yeah, it's true that it's not like linear over time, but that's necessarily gotten better for everybody.
Okay. Nick.
I'll kind of pass for now.
Okay. Yeah, so the first part, to become wealthier, a country needs strong growth in productivity. I don't know that that's right. I think they want growth in production because then people are getting more stuff, so they're wealthier. That, yeah.
Is that different from that's what I assume they meant by productivity.
Productivity means how much stuff you're getting per unit of input. So you could get wealthier potentially without getting more productive, without increasing the productivity, just by doubling the amount of resources you're able to use or something like that.
Or trading with China or something. You don't have to actually produce anything, you just get things from China.
Right. Yep. That's an example. Nick?
Is it? I always thought of it specifically as per unit of labor input, but is it
Right.
kind of more general than that?
Well, you can say labor productivity, and usually when people say productivity unqualified, they mean labor productivity.
Nice.
But you could say, like, what is the productivity of our steel? And if you come up with a new way to like build buildings using only a fraction of the steel, then your steel has gotten more productive.
You
or
can
something
actually
like that.
produce buildings with like skyscrapers with wood, and you can 3D print wood as well.
Yeah. So you know, I think there's ways to use resources more efficiently, and the one we usually focus on is labor. And when we're talking about productivity, we're usually talking about labor productivity. Here in this paragraph, he said the output of goods or services from given inputs of labor and capital.
I see.
Actually, we do have a couple of comments on the live stream. So Michael says, maybe not increased job opportunities, since technology, I feel, should be meant to decrease the need for human labor. I think that's a good point. And Mitchell says, it seems like just that it says a theory. Wages on commissioned people can grow in times of increased spending and productivity, but hourly workers will remain flat. So I think it's possible to have increased production without increased wages. I think that's a really good point. I think a lot of times like this paragraph implies, it says for most people in theory at least, higher productivity means the expectation of rising wages and abundant job opportunities. But I think as you guys brought up, especially Steve, you know, we could have higher productivity, be producing the same amount of stuff and just using less labor. So that means wages go down, or the number of jobs go down, the aggregate number of wages go down. Yeah.
Is the expectation coming from just how people want things to be or what they associate with prosperity, or is it coming from the idea that if labor is a constraining resource, like why is the idea there that wages would necessarily go up as things? become more productive?
So-
Can you expect them
So I think there's a few steps to this, to why people have this reasoning.
Right.
And I think one is just that if we're able to be more productive, if our productivity increases, we should expect that given whatever resources we have, we should be producing more stuff. So that in that sense, we should be wealthier. And there's also this sense that if we're producing more stuff, then people have money to buy the stuff. So the economy is just generally going better, and generally you would kind of assume that there's more jobs and higher wages and that kind of thing.
Yeah.
But you can produce more things in like the digital economy and not have as many people. Like, what was it? Snapchat or whatever had 50 employees, and they sold it for $19 billion. I think it was.
Right.
And so
So that's sort of productive.
and then you can have like
So that's-
Microsoft and produce unlimited copies of Windows, and you just have so many employees.
Right. So we can come up with plenty of examples of very high productivity with very low wages.
Right.
What's the productivity paradox is more about why isn't productivity growing more? It seems like with our technology, productivity should be growing more. We should be producing more per hour of labor. And I think there's a couple big reasons I would give for this in my mind. One is that the level of employment in the economy has less to do with the amount of work we need people to do and more to do with the number of jobs we want people to have. I talk about this a lot. We use economic policy to keep people employed. So if you're keeping people employed and you're just doing it for the purpose of giving them money, then you're not doing it for the purpose of increasing output. So this on its own, you would expect to at least temper the productivity of our labor because we're keeping people needlessly employed. So I think that's a big part of it. Another big part of it is, what we've talked about in here a little bit is Baumol's cost disease, which is the idea that as workers get more productive, they leave those jobs because they're not needed, or like if there's technology or something that makes production more efficient and it needs less labor, the workers leave those jobs, so that labor is gone, and then they go into jobs that are less productive, that are more labor intensive. So there's kind of this balancing force. But these two things, go ahead.
I don't know if you want to finish before I answer.
Yeah, I was going to say these two things kind of go together, which is that if we keep everyone employed, if everyone has to be employed, and we don't need them at a specific thing, we're going to put them somewhere else where their labor is not necessarily going to result in more output. Yeah.
I guess I was trying to think through, if you didn't have any artificial interference with the labor market,
Right.
it seems like even if people are going to where they're now needed, it would still be part of productivity growing. Like even like your second point doesn't seem like it would. I'm trying to think through your second point without interference in the labor market. 'Cause like if we don't need people to farm anymore, which we don't, then they go to other things, right? Instead of being like all farmers where they could produce a ton of food per person. So they go to other things, but wouldn't that still mean the whole society is becoming more prosperous because they're doing those things that didn't exist?
So then there's the question of what counts as labor and what doesn't, and what counts as economic output and what doesn't. So if you just don't need as much labor and people are going home and kind of sitting around, usually that wouldn't be measured in our productivity statistics. You'd just be getting by with less labor. But if you say like, well, however anyone spends their time, that counts as labor, then yes, those people would be less productive. Yeah.
But I'm trying to understand people, let's say, who do go to something that counts as labor.
Yeah.
But there's less output per person because now you have more nurses or something like that. But shouldn't you also be able to capture that? Well, maybe nurses isn't a good example, but that the output of their labor is now like there's now that output that they're doing, right?
Right, but their output might be more labor intensive. So we measure output in kind of like dollars of value of stuff created, right? So you might have someone who's a nurse who wasn't a nurse before, and they're producing X amount of dollars worth of nursing services, but at their previous job, maybe it was 100X. And that job isn't needed anymore. So they're still going somewhere where their labor is being used, but it's not producing the same like magnitude of output. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So is it then that we shouldn't necessarily assume that things will become more productive, that like they will get more output per hour in a better economy, that you're just going to produce more stuff and people will go to where they're needed?
I think that's part of it. I think, the idea of caring about how much, I don't know that we should care about the productivity of our labor. I don't think it's that important. I think we should care about overall level of production because that's how much stuff is being produced for people and that they would benefit from. And then, then it's this whole thing about like, ooh, what do you classify as labor and what's not? And nurse, we happen to count as labor, but there might be someone who doesn't have a job who's, however they're spending their time is providing some kind of benefit to the economy that isn't being captured. Yeah, I mean, like that's kind of a good analogy to a nurse. Yeah.
And why couldn't it still be the case that even if people are doing that, there is still more output per hour of labor on average in the economy because all of those things are getting.
What is an hour of labor? So if you just say however anyone lives their life, that's labor, and people are just living their lives. People are existing, and they have a certain number of hours of existing. If you increase the output, then you are increasing productivity, right? Because it's productivity, it's amount of economic output per hour lived by the people.
Right.
Exactly. So that would be an increase in productivity.
And I don't see why that couldn't happen within the quote unquote workday as well. That it could be going up on average, even if people are moving to the places where they're needed.
So to be clear, productivity is going up. It's just going up more slowly than a lot of people would expect.
I see.
Based on what?
Yeah, good question.
Like, what are the expectations from?
Yeah.
The expectations are based on like looking at how powerful the technology is and imagining, okay, this technology can multiply someone's labor by X amount. And they're expecting productivity to go up by that amount. But in reality, the level of production in the economy is the rate at which it increases is going to always be constrained by the rate at which people's spending increases. So no matter how efficient you get with your technology, the economy is not going to produce what people don't have the money to buy, which is kind of what I always say. So the growth of production, the growth of output is going to be constrained by spending rather than by how fancy our technology is. Yeah.
Sorry, I just also feel like I'm confused by the puzzle because in a way, like we only need a few people now to produce the food for everybody.
Right.
So that clearly has happened.
Mm-hmm.
And if that's failing to be measured as an increase in productivity, it's because they were taking one standard before, which is like just feeding everyone somehow. And now we're including a whole bunch of other things like yoga classes in the output that wasn't somehow in the output before, so it's not getting measured properly. Do you see what I mean? Like it seems like there is an increase.
So the question is,
and I guess why is it like Joan said? Why is it less than what people would expect?
The productivity or the production, the output?
I guess either one. Yeah, I don't know.
So
sorry, maybe I'm just not understanding why this is a puzzle. Like what the puzzle is.
So the puzzle is, imagine that I'm a widget maker and I can produce one widget an hour. And then someone gives me a magic hammer, and now I can hammer out 100 widgets an hour.
Yeah.
You would expect the labor productivity to be 100 times what it was.
Well, I guess what I'm wondering is, like, how do we think of this paradox when what happens is people do produce 1,000 potatoes per person or something now, or more, and then people just move to other things, like you were saying.
Right. So exactly. So now I'm producing 100 times as many widgets. So people assume, okay, our productivity should be 100 times as much. But really what happened is now we fired the other 99 guys who were making the widgets. And now they're going teaching yoga classes, which is a far less productive in terms of output job than the widget producer.
Right. So it seems like you'd have to kind of take the average productivity given the technology we have now and somehow see, I don't know. So farming is like really productive. Yoga class is not that productive. Seems like you could theoretically have some sense of the average.
Yeah, that's what they get. They get the average. So the question is, why is the average lower than kind of what you would expect? And that's because people are partly because people are moving into less productive jobs.
So then what they would expect from the technology across all fields? Or?
Well, I think we have this idea that workers do what they do, and then the technology comes in and makes them more productive by a certain amount. But really what you're doing is you're eliminating a lot of those workers and they're going into less productive fields.
I see. So it's not accounting for that.
Right, exactly.
Sorry.
And then there's, in England and the southern U.S., they're having issues with migrant workers because of the border wall and Brexit. And so they're producing, picking machines that pick strawberries and things.
Sure.
And so they're trying to replace all those pickers with robots. But in the meantime, those like strawberries and things are rotting in the fields because there aren't any migrant workers to pick them.
So that hurts your productivity right there.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and the other thing you mentioned about not assimilating how to use innovation, so that although the technology, AI, and all of the kind of fancy innovations that are happening aren't affecting productivity.
Yeah, so I don't think that's the issue. I
You
think
don't?
no,
That's his
very
point.
far from it. Yeah, I think it's more well, it's sort of the issue, but the question is why isn't it affecting output as much yet? And the answer is these other things. So the answer is that we talk about someone going from doing a really efficient job to a more labor-intensive job that's less productive, but also a lot of those less productive jobs, people are working them because we're trying to keep everyone employed. Mm-hmm. They're not necessarily, like we talk about nurses are probably pretty useful, but it's not all nurses, right? Some of it is just,
banjo players.
Some of it is like banjo players who we hate.
We don't like banjo players?
Yeah.
No, I like them well enough. But.
Yeah. So it's this tricky thing. I think mainly the thing is that that focusing on labor productivity is not particularly useful.
I'm not convinced that he is wrong the way you are.
Who's wrong?
The writer of the article is wrong.
Wrong about what?
Not assimilating the technology so that we don't see the effect.
No, I was explaining why we're not assimilating the technology.
Here's an example.
I thought you said that you thought he was wrong about that.
Well, I think he's wrong that that's like the ultimate reason, proximate ultimate. Yeah. I think, you can ask why we're not seeing the benefits of technology, why it's taking so long to see those benefits.
Right.
And I think a big part of the answer is that we don't allow it to happen. We use our economic policy to keep everyone employed, even though we don't need to.
Well, that's one part of it. That's not the main part of it.
What's the main part?
The main part, from his point of view, not mine, is that things like AI are not well understood enough to be able to incorporate the use of them. Just like the 1987 computer revolution and the PCs and all that.
I mean,
there's a delay.
So I think that's always true. It takes some time to, fully realize the true power of our various technological advancements, that kind of thing.
We have evidence.
Right,
of that.
but the productivity paradox is more about why aren't the things that we already have leading to more productivity? It's not about, and he's kind of coming up with a story about how maybe we don't have what we think we have, that kind of thing. I don't think that's the main issue. Yeah, Richard.
In the legal field, there are actually AI that can do like both lawyers and paralegals work, but the profit mechanism for it, how much you get per hour, is preventing them from adopting that AI technology.
Right, because if you're paid by the hour and then you can do it really fast, then so that can be preventing some productivity as well.
Yeah, that's a bad incentive.
Yeah.
I was trying to think about, like, in academia, the output does seem like, I don't know in terms of the quality, but like certainly the number of studies that a person can do changes, and how quickly it changes pretty in par with the technology. And I think that's because it's not like, I don't know, somehow it's not like people are leaving that field. It's not like you need it's not like there's a certain amount of output that's constrained by the money people can spend, I guess. Like, right. People sort of pay your salary as an academic, and then you produce as much as you produce.
What do you mean by the technology?
So, like computer programs that can do your statistics for you, which make things a lot faster, access to online research participants. I'm only thinking of my own field, but...
And that's changed enormously.
Yeah, so now what happens is the expectation of the number of studies that a person does just goes up across the whole field. Right? So that does kind of scale up.
I don't think, in terms of measuring economic output, I don't think like academic research is usually counted.
That's not why I'm bringing it up. Okay. I'm trying to bring it up as an example where your constraint isn't so present. I'm trying to think if it looks like you see what you would expect to see where technology goes up. And
right, when people aren't being paid by the hour, that kind of thing, you mean?
Well, yeah, or when it's not constrained by the money that people can spend. I think. Like,
not at all. Economic output is all about producing stuff that people buy with their money. Right. So if you have something that's not based on money, then you're not going to see this problem.
That was sort of my trying to do my thought experiment with it.
I think that's right.
There's other issues like, are the quality of the studies good or whatever, but just in terms of like the rate of the amount of stuff that people are turning out, it's gone up quite a bit, I think. I don't know if you have the same experience in your field, that like technology would increase that.
I think in my field, it's more like the threshold for a result that was going to get into a good journal.
I see.
Just went up.
Yeah. Okay.
And so you were just expected to have a lot more results.
Right. That seems like another version of increased productivity.
But a way. I was wondering whether an analogy for that would be something like you have this new technology that lets you produce 100 with this magic hammer, but now the market is kind of flooded with those things, and so the price you can get for them goes down, and so that's another way that the productivity measured this way would be depressed.
Yes.
Yeah.
So
People just don't need 100 times as many.
So that is a great example. So there's all kinds of value that we have in our world that is not represented by economic output. And if something happens where we're able to produce stuff for people really, really, really cheaply, then that's not really going to be represented by economic output either, because economic output is like the per dollar output.
Right.
It's really measuring our production of stuff that is expensive enough that people really need to spend money on it.
Yeah.
Right? So you could have a situation where everyone's better off, everyone has more stuff over time, like, and that's increasing really, really, really rapidly. And we actually do see this with, like, you know, smartphones getting, you know, smaller and more powerful, and, you know, especially like in the technology area, we see this. And that's something that's not captured by any of this at all. So the output and the level of productivity is not reflective of everything that might benefit people.
Yeah, I guess I would need to know what are some of the measurements of productivity.
Yeah.
Which now
So
we're
it's-
talking about it as if we know, but I don't know.
Yeah, so output is usually measured in dollars. It's
Well,
yeah.
right, but how did they get that measurement? I mean,
It's the total amount of money that people spent on buying stuff.
okay, so
Yeah.
it's all consumer spending.
Basically, yeah.
Okay.
I mean, they factor in like intermediate spending, but usually that gets canceled out because you know the business buys its resource ingredients or its inputs, and then it produces an output, and then you
And
yeah.
how do you get from that to rate of productivity?
So you just divide it by the number of hours worked.
Where do you get the number of hours worked?
Well, you have to define what work is, what counts as a job.
Yeah.
And then you know look at the statistics of how many people have jobs and whether they're full time, how many hours they put in, that kind of thing.
Okay, so it's just across the board jobs. I mean, there isn't any attempt to categorize anything.
There are attempts to categorize things, but when we're talking about the general productivity of the economy, that's about kind of the aggregate.
Yeah.
I see. So the idea is we get better technology, people are able to produce stuff that people want to buy, and they're able to buy it because somehow their labor's worth more now because they're producing more, and so they're getting paid more, or something like that. That's somehow like the story for how this is supposed to work. That creates the
Right.
paradox.
There's this. People have this idea that workers get paid according to the amount of value they produce, and if you make them more productive, then they're going to produce more value. That kind of thing.
Right.
So
and that would
yeah.
potentially be true if the laborers have very high bargaining power. That would be like the limit of what people might be willing to pay them, or something like that.
Yeah, I mean, it depends on how you're defining value and all of that and all of that stuff. Yeah. I mean, really, the labor market, I like to say, is a market for getting people to do things.
Yeah.
So you pay people what you need to pay them to get them to do the work. Like,
Yeah.
that's what it's about.
No,
It's
I
not about,
understand. But to be sympathetic to this view, I'm assuming they're thinking about the upper limit, where like I'm not going to pay you more as a company. I'm not going to pay you more than the money you make my company. I mean, if I'm really an efficient company, right? So that's like
Right.
the most I'm going to pay you is a little bit less than the money you make my company.
Yeah, I mean, marginally, like hiring you versus not hiring you. Once you're hired and once you're working, it's hard to say. It's hard to say which person produced the value, or how the split is between like the worker and the equipment they use and like all that kind of stuff.
I know, but in general, this is the idea that it's
Right.
upper bound,
Yes.
right? That they're not going to be paid more than that.
I mean, sort of. I don't think people are thinking in terms of upper bounds. I think it's more simplistic than that. I think they're just thinking, well, workers should get paid according to the value they create. So if they can create 10 times as much value in the same amount of time, then they should get paid 10 times as much, that kind of thing. Yeah. I mean, I think you're basically on the right track. They're just not thinking about it in this kind of...
But I just don't believe that economists are thinking in a moral way. Like, that's not usually how they would frame you.
You don't think economists are thinking in a moral way?
Well, I mean, not like overtly like that. And
I don't think so. So it depends whether you're talking about like just people in general, whether you're talking about economists. I think economists, yeah, I mean, they are baffled by this. They call it a productivity paradox. Yeah, Richard.
They actually have. There's a term. Some guy in like the 1930s, I think it was. He tried to measure output per worker, and now they're putting like they try bracelets and like key trackers and things like that on in computers and whatnot to measure the productivity per worker. And in like Amazon warehouses, they measure the output of the workers, and if they don't put out so many packages per hour or whatever, then they can get fired for that by an algorithm instead of a person.
They used to measure keystrokes too in computer companies for office workers.
Yeah, and writers used to get paid by the word, so you had like
Exactly.
Dickens writing all these words.
Yeah.
So
Those are so specific. I mean, the other work that we're talking about, like nurses or
Right.
that how is that measured? I mean,
Yeah, that's a good question.
So
I don't.
yeah,
this discussion actually made me kind of think about, you mentioned how economic output is measured by the consumption that occurs in the economy.
yeah.
And so that made me question, well, it's, again, what about all of the things that add value to society that are part of human well-being and happiness that are not well measured by this
Right.
metric? And actually, the whole, in a way, this highlights how the economists just keep banging their head against the wall to reinforce ideas that they've kind of clung on to for the last 100 years. In a way, I realize that measuring output for a certain big share of general well-being, it really matters. But something like yoga, for example, that probably pays less, but if it's making people healthier, then that doesn't get measured.
Yeah.
Maybe,
Yeah.
well, it actually doesn't, because then those people will spend less on healthcare, and the GDP goes down.
Right.
And we can...
And not just
Yeah.
yoga. I mean, like the example of technology getting smaller and cheaper and everything. That too. The fact like this might be 10,000 times as powerful as a computer I could get a few years ago, but it's not 10,000 times as much output. It's according to the dollar value.
Seems to be, I would like to hear the justification for it, or like the strong case for using dollars, but it does seem like
Using dollars for what?
For like the measure of output.
To measure the
Oh
output.
no, it's a great measure of economic output as long as you understand what economic output is.
Right.
Yeah.
But in
Exactly.
terms of how technology is supposed to be working, or why this would be a paradox, like it seems confusing to me because it still seems like the dollars spent, I'm trying to map that onto what we actually think technology is supposed to do. I guess like your example of the phone, but also like with healthcare, the more money we spend on healthcare, the better off we are not. Like it doesn't seem like anything's capturing how well educated we are, like the healthcare thing.
Well,
or
the
any
other,
of that.
the other thing is that people aren't
Right,
widgets. Andrew Yang
impact,
keeps
yeah.
saying this, like, machines replace all these workers, and then what, you tell a guy who's been working at the plant to just go take a Coursera course to learn machine learning, or he says that guy's gonna punch you in the face. Yeah, because people aren't widgets.
Right.
Like it takes 7 years to learn programming.
Right.
Yeah. So I mean, I would say that measuring economic output is useful, and it is a useful metric. It's a useful metric for telling us how much benefit the economy is providing for people, and that's not how much benefit are we getting from things we have to buy, things we have to trade for. Now, obviously, healthcare increasing in costs. If you just look at that, that's not beneficial, even though it would increase economic output, right? So that's the example. So I'm going to push.
But where's the benefit coming from? Like, if everything just got more expensive, theoretically, output would be higher, but that's not.
So this is the key thing. You're asking the key question, which is we keep the purchasing power of the dollar stable. Okay. So even though specific things might get more expensive, the value of a dollar remains relatively consistent over time. There's 2% inflation per year or something like that.
So then I still think we have a major gap in healthcare though with that, because I don't see how, what's the thing that's kept stable in terms of healthcare prices? So
healthcare prices, are going to be factored into the market basket that's used in the consumer price index. So if you left them out of the basket, right, then they could go really, really high. And
what counts as a unit, like a doctor's visit? Because I understand
what counts as a unit?
I understand about keeping the price of an apple stable.
Yeah.
What's the healthcare unit that I'm keeping stable?
Oh,
the amount
I don't know in terms of
something.
In terms of
what
what
am
those.
I getting? Does it factor in what I'm getting, or just the amount
Maybe
that I
just
spend
broken
per
down
year.
into small pieces.
Yeah.
You know, like,
I mean, so there's a lot of arguments about how to appropriately, weight the basket of goods that goes into these calculations and that kind of thing.
I don't know. Maybe this isn't that important. It is a big part of what people spend on, so it seems important if we're getting it wrong.
It is
Basket,
important,
but
so I don't think we're getting it wrong necessarily. I mean, like, obviously there's lots of arguments to be had, but I think we generally get this stuff right in terms of the purchasing power of the dollar and factoring in.
do you think that anything about output captures like getting like the benefit from healthcare that we're getting increasing? Like, because it's not looking at like outcomes like life expectancy or maybe I'm just getting confused.
Maybe reducing greenhouse gas emissions is a cleaner example.
Yeah, that's a good example. That's obviously
Right.
not in there.
That's
Not in there.
Like maybe some of our
Yeah.
technological improvements are giving us a benefit, that's not in the numerator and that
Yeah.
ratio, which
Totally.
is just, we're being more careful about
Yeah,
climate impacts.
Yes.
right.
No, we're not.
Hypothetically, we could be.
Well, maybe if we.
This is hypothetical.
There's some technologies
Yeah.
that would be even worse if we.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Uh,
I guess I understood
maybe,
that one
it's like
better, but yeah.
PCBs in the river. We've got fewer
Right.
PCBs in the river.
That's great. Where did they go? So I think that's right. So I think basically Nick has like this clean example, which you understand, of things that aren't captured by output.
Yeah.
And then you have an example that's kind of in between, right?
Yeah, and the reason I guess I'm hung up on it is like it's a big one and it's more of a real-time one. Like I kind of understand the climate one to the extent that it's kind of like a future problem that we're creating. Maybe it's also an immediate problem, and maybe that would also factor into economic output though if you're getting like floods happening right now, stuff like that. But healthcare, like the benefits are happening now, but it just seems like
Well, I think we were talking about like the benefits of reducing carbon emissions, but also taking a hit on economic output. That's what you're
I
saying,
think
right?
Yeah.
in some households, towns, whole countries, they really are reducing their greenhouse gas emissions, say from from electricity generation.
Totally, yeah.
And maybe the result of that is that in some sense the value of the electricity that we're getting is higher,
Right.
but you don't see that in the
Yeah, okay, I
in the
understand.
statistics.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yep.
yeah, I'm still hung up on the idea of how to measure things that aren't making widgets and, the things that you can count as output.
Yeah. How to measure them?
Yeah, how are they measured in this scheme of things?
Well, they're not
They're
measured.
measuring
They're not measured
productivity.
in this scheme. They're not measured in productivity.
They're not.
No, not at all.
Well, not if nobody's paying for them. But like a yoga class, if you pay for the yoga class, that would be
Right.
included, right?
Because the person is paying enough that you can classify it as a job, and now it counts as labor, and now you can make the calculation.
And the value is just assumed to be whatever people are willing to, whatever people
Right.
did fork over for it.
I'm just really having a hard time understanding.
So it's
the
how
trade-off
much
here.
people are willing to pay, but I thought you were talking about people getting paid. How
Which
much they are paid, the hourly rate of workers. How does that figure in?
Mostly we were talking about how much people are paying for products.
Wait a second, I'm so confused
Yeah.
now. Because it seems like the only way productivity goes up or production goes up is by people spending more money.
Right.
And you just talked about price. I guess price level. People have to spend more money. Price levels have to stay the same. So there's more stuff being produced. Okay, wait,
Yeah.
no, that part does make sense. That's what people are expecting, and they expect that with like let's say the same amount of labor, they expect all those things to go up.
Right.
Okay.
Because
the technology is making the labor more useful and so you have more stuff
Right.
happen.
They're expecting that because we can produce more stuff with the same inputs, that we will be producing more stuff with the same inputs.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. And so some of our reasons that doesn't happen is like certain benefits are not captured in there that we're using the technology for, including the fact that people then like we're getting more efficient with technology to produce some stuff, but we don't just infinitely produce that stuff. We move on to using our labor towards other stuff that may not have that same productivity, like teaching a yoga class. That's like a second reason, kind of. You don't see that. And then the third reason is we're not maxing out what we can do with the technology because of a money constraint. That's kind of your reason.
Right, and that we're keeping everyone employed
And we're giving
for the
people
sake of
more
employment,
timeline.
not because of the
Yeah.
output we want from it.
Okay.
Yeah.
This is where you really need a chart.
I know,
We
we
got
need
a
the
chart.
whiteboard.
Wish we had the
Yeah,
whiteboard,
Yeah.
we should try to figure out how, because the other rooms are always busy now, right? We
So
might
it
want to
looks
try
like,
to find another room.
Yeah.
I mean, we could be upstairs next time, for example, that has a whiteboard and a TV.
Oh.
Yeah. So did you have a comment?
I am still not completely clear on what productivity, how it's measured. It
So
seems to
it's-
be measured on both sides, on the spending side and on the labor side, which
It's-
is a little confusing.
It's the amount of stuff produced in terms of amount of stuff purchased in dollars,
Yeah.
divided by the number of hours of labor that went in.
Yeah, it's the number of hours of labor that is a problem for
Yeah.
Because, I mean, how do you figure the number of hours of labor in
It's like-
jobs that are not hourly? I mean, where does that figure come from?
Well, I mean, you estimate like a
National Bureau of Labor Statistics. Like there's
okay, yeah.
big bureaucracy, with
Right.
people trying
Right.
to
And they keep track
it by
of that.
calling up employers and
Yeah.
doing surveys.
Yeah.
Right?
Okay.
But another thing that could be happening, like to that point, Nick, in terms of how they're even measuring it, is like people might be actually working less. Like they might be showing up to their office job and not actually working
Just
half the
sitting
day.
around.
Yeah.
Yeah, right.
No, really, compared to being in the fields where you're definitely doing that work like
Right.
that whole time. And so some of this might
Right.
might actually be happening and not be being tracked because your employer is expecting you to work a certain amount of time.
Well, all
You
of
have to
that
be paid
counts
for
as
that.
labor. Like if people show up to their job and they're being lazy, that would not be. You wouldn't say this person is being really productive. They're just not working most of the time. You would say this person's being unproductive.
Well, no, but I
Right.
mean,
But they're in a place where they're supposed to be, so that's
Well, they're in
counted
their
as
job, so
labor.
it counts toward their labor time.
yeah, but I mean,
There
that's,
you go.
yeah, exactly. That's another explanation. And
Yeah.
maybe they're being productive on personal stuff. You know,
Yeah,
they're buying
yeah,
stuff online, their
Right.
groceries, and they're sending emails and
Sure.
whatever.
But it would help. But it would be an explanation for this.
Yeah, exactly.
This
People actually are working
Paradox or
less
whatever,
and they're
right?
producing
Yeah.
more, but they're just also like pretending to work.
the
other
technology
days.
lets them
Yeah.
get all their work done
Right.
by 10 o'clock.
Yeah,
Yeah,
and then they
exactly.
hang out
And
and,
then they
take
just-
breaks.
Right,
Yeah.
they talk to each other
Yeah.
and like jobs
Collect
even
their
expect
paycheck
more
for
of
the rest of
that.
the day,
Yeah,
but-
exactly.
Yeah. So the question,
Yeah.
I mean, I think there's a lot of that, and then the question is, why is that happening?
Right.
Why are we keeping
Part of the
people
question
employed
is
in
like,
this way?
why are the companies not just hiring them for 2 hours a day, or like
Oh.
firing them and only paying them for those 2 hours, or
Or
something like that?
firing them and hiring more productive workers,
Right.
or getting rid of most of their workers and keeping the ones that are left, that kind of thing.
Well, they do hire contractors for that reason and
Yeah.
freelancers just to minimize
Yeah.
the idea that somebody would just come and sit there.
Right. So there's
Yeah.
the micro view, like what is each company doing? Why are they hiring unproductive workers, or why are they
Mhm.
managing their labor unproductively? That kind of
Right.
thing. And then there's the macro thing, which is what is the incentive for companies to do this? Why, at the broad
Yeah.
level of the whole economy, is this a thing? Why are we making this happen through our economic policy?
Right.
And it's because we want to keep people employed, so they can have money.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Back to that.
Yeah.
Always comes back to that.
Always comes back to that. Yeah. So I mean, I think that's kind of the biggest factor. You know, a lot of the reason why we see this kind of productivity paradox is because we don't have a basic income. If we had a basic income, then you'd see a combination of fewer people working and higher output, because people would have more money to spend to activate the
Yeah,
economy's
and it
production,
wouldn't require the
Yeah.
work.
and it wouldn't require them to work.
Right.
Yep.
Interesting.
Anyone? Let's see. We got a few more comments on here. So Michael says, are they differentiating between the necessity of what is being produced? For example, you could argue a basketball player isn't producing anything necessary while a doctor is. No, they're not. So, you know, when we measure economic output, it's just the aggregate of all the stuff that people are buying, all the stuff that people are consuming.
Like weighted by how much they're paying for it.
Yeah.
Right?
Weighted by how much, yeah, it's the aggregate dollar amount of all the stuff that people are consuming, right?
Yeah.
So there is some weighting being done in the consumer price index, in that basket of goods, and that, you know, it's not exactly based on the necessity of what is being produced, but it's based on various things. So if there's any weighting that's happening, it's happening at that end, and then that's what establishes the value of the dollar, and then we just blanket apply the value of the dollar to all of our production. Yeah.
So, like you said, just as another micro example, like if
Yeah.
they stabilize the value of the dollar against food and computer, but the food gets way tastier and the computer gets way better, you are seeing an improvement, and it's not showing up in the measure of production.
Yes.
Okay.
Yep.
Because that also, I guess we talked about that, but that also seems important in terms of what's
Yeah.
happening, the quality is getting.
And then there's all kinds of arguments people have about how you should change the basket of goods as the quality of the stuff that's available in the economy changes. Like you can't really compare prices now to prices 100 years ago because people are buying different stuff. That kind of thing.
Like you have to include more things in it and stuff like that.
Right. Exactly.
And exclude some things too.
Yeah. So Michael also says, what if the same amount of money is being spent but can purchase more things because efficiency and abundance due to technology drives down prices? Would they count that as productivity staying the same?
Yeah.
So I think they would count that as more productivity because the real output, the inflation adjusted output, has increased. But really what happens is they don't allow deflation to happen. We don't allow prices to decrease in aggregate through the whole economy. If there are specific things whose prices decrease, for example, like technology like smartphone or anything, those things kind of like they start to disappear from the market basket because they, the 100x, 1000x power of your computer is not reflected as 1000x value in the market basket. It's per unit of computing power. You have to purchase less of it from the economy, so its representation shrinks in terms of the purchasing power of the dollar.
Right.
Yeah.
So that's what I was saying. Like that's not going to be measured as better production.
That's not going to be measured as better production. But if prices throughout the whole economy go down, then that is going to be measured as better production.
But if quality across the whole economy goes up, it doesn't get measured. Like that could happen theoretically for everything, and the price might not be reflecting that.
If quality across the entire economy goes up, it depends how we measure that quality and how it affects price. I mean, really, what we do is all of the calculations of quality and changing of things, that all goes into the consumer price index.
Quality into it?
What do you mean?
Well, I guess I was thinking they're trying to just help people have like an understandable psychological unit, so that might be more bounded by the object or the function than the quality.
Well, for certain things, if it's a higher quality, then you pay more. So, if people are switching over to buying organic food, that kind of thing.
But then doesn't the market basket just keep the price of regular food stable, or does it also keep the price of luxury foods?
Well, if everyone's switching over to the luxury goods, then...
Yeah, but then wouldn't they just keep that at the price? I'm confused about how it works, I guess.
Yeah, so I'm saying all these calculations happen there. And then once you have the dollars, you just apply those dollars universally.
But I guess I'm asking, is it possible that the quality of everything goes up, but the price level stays, like the amount that people are spending stays the same and the price level stays the same?
The quality of everything goes up, so people are able to buy higher quality things in general, like in aggregate through the economy, and the price level stays the same. And you could. I think this is kind of like details that are, handled by those kind of arguments about how the market basket should be weighted, that kind of thing. If the quality of an individual thing goes up and its price goes up, that's one thing. If the quality of everything goes up the same amount, and I think then it gets hard to say how to compare the different economies, that kind of thing. So are you asking, can you have a situation where over time, compared to 100 years ago, people spending the same amount of money would be able to buy much better quality stuff, but you wouldn't say that inflation had happened or something like that? Is that what you're saying?
There are these anchors. There are these constraints. Go ahead.
Okay. I think is an interesting example. There are things. There's bananas. Let's see, about 60 years ago went extinct, and so they produced it. It took them a while to find a different type of banana, and so those, as the old type of banana became rarer and rarer. I don't know what happened to the price of those, but there's because of a blight,
right.
and it's spreading throughout the world with various means. And there's another example of chocolate. They don't really have. There's a blight spreading for that, but they don't have a substitute Yeah, and so the price of that might go up, but they don't have a substitute, or if they do have to find a substitute like a synthetic chocolate, they're actually working on something like that, then they're well, how do you measure that with the whole productivity and things like that?
Yeah, so this is just one good, right? So as things kind of like shift in and out of what consumers spend the money on, then you kind of make those adjustments in the basket. So we kind of trust the experts to make those adjustments. They don't trust each other. They're arguing with each other all the time in figuring this stuff out. And there's different consumer price indexes and stuff like that.
I guess I just don't understand. Maybe it's not important. I guess I don't really understand how the basket works. Like I know I spent a long time trying to figure out how your basket works in your paper, so I kind of understand that one. But I thought it was just, I don't know, just kind of like these are like basic units of things that people buy, and we're trying to keep the prices like basically the same. I didn't think they were factoring in the quality of them, or like which type of.
Well, the quality means it's once you've doubled the quality of something, now it's a different thing. Now it's.
Yeah, I guess I wouldn't know necessarily, depending on how I would want to make things seem psychologically stable. Or
Well, the important thing for keeping things psychologically stable is that people's expectations of what a dollar means are pretty consistent from day to day, from month to month.
Yeah, but I feel like we expect to spend a certain amount on a computer, whether we expect it to get better. We don't necessarily expect it to get more expensive because it gets better. I feel like that's true across a lot of goods. So,
I mean, I think that's true because of historically how computers have gone. But if you had, you can imagine a scenario in which, it's not possible to produce a computer that's twice as good for, for the same price, right? Like you can imagine that, okay, now we've come out with a more powerful computer. It's twice as powerful, but it costs twice as much. And if you and you would still pay for the same amount for the old kind of computer, and that's like we could hypothetically imagine that scenario. But the reality of what happened was, technology was such that competition could, they could afford to make the new computers much cheaper, that kind of thing.
But also, there are hundreds of different things being priced, and you've only got $1, and so
Right.
it kind of has to average out.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Yep. Richard.
There's a problem with inferior goods, I remember. Like, you don't have enough money to buy a quality good, so you buy this inferior good, and it like breaks down in a much shorter time than you buy a $500 Walmart sofa, and it gets destroyed in like a year. But if you buy a $1,000 IKEA or whatever sofa, and it lasts you 5 years or more, then if you have enough money, then you eliminate the jobs for the Walmart sofa.
Yeah, I think that's right. So for those who aren't familiar with the term inferior good, it's a good for whom if people have less money, they buy more of it. And if they have more money, they buy less of it. So if people have more money, they're not going to buy the Walmart couches, and then the people making those couches or selling those couches lose their jobs, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
So I don't know, can you tie that back into kind of what we were talking about?
If you increase the quality of the IKEA couch, and you have enough people are earning enough money from producing IKEA couches, then they can buy IKEA couches. Like the whole back in like 1920 or whatever, Ford assembly plant worker, they were going to pay them enough money to buy a Model T Ford. So if you pay them enough money to buy an IKEA couch, then they're going to buy an IKEA couch instead of a Walmart couch.
You're saying if we pay people in general, if like the basic income is high enough to buy an IKEA couch?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think the Henry Ford thing, where it's like, oh well, how are people going to buy your cars if you don't pay them enough? I think that's kind of a silly story, because if you're running a business, you want to, and it's not something that really, it wasn't a real thing that happened. Like that's kind of an apocryphal thing. But if you're running a business, you would want to pay your labor less than what you get in profit. So you'd want to pay the sum of your labor and all the other resources and materials and everything less than what you would get from selling the car. So it's a little bit silly to expect your workers to buy.
Well, they just have to buy one over multiple years.
Well, that's true. But I mean, there's no reason why it should line up at all or anything like that. Yeah.
There's another example with fast food workers having like 136% or more like return rate or whatever, or quit the job because they get fed up with it.
Or turnover.
Turnover. And if you pay them more or give them better benefits or whatever, then they are more likely to stay around, and so they become more productive and things.
Yeah. So I think this is one of those things where the business has decided that the cost of the turnover rate is worth the savings that they get on paying them less. Yeah, I think that's pretty straightforward.
Some companies are badly managed. Probably.
Some companies are badly managed. That's true.
But it's a big industry.
But kind of back to the Ford thing. Like you can imagine that being true for Ford itself, but the other customers have to be getting their money from somewhere too, right?
Yeah.
So you can't imagine that the whole economy works this way, where everyone can afford everything that the economy produces. So this is where some of the tension comes in,
well,
right?
Wouldn't it just get thrown out then? I mean, what do you mean?
Wouldn't it just get thrown out?
What do you mean people can't afford? Oh, you mean
From their wages. So there has to be a source of income that allows people to spend more money than they get from wages. Otherwise, in aggregate, it's not worth it for businesses to pay the labor.
So what is that now? Credit cards or something?
It's credit, and it's So it's businesses that are failing and actually not producing anything, but still paying workers because they were able to borrow or they got investment, that kind of thing. So there's money that's being paid out to people through wages that's actually not going into production, or there's money that people are getting in some other way that's actually not going into production.
Well, we're seeing that right now. WeWork, Uber, the bankruptcies of Thomas Cook. And the things are starting to unravel slowly.
Yep. And we see it all the time, right? This is something that's been constant with us throughout history. And we've had the business cycle where, business is booming, more and more credit, and then it kind of comes back in again, and, that kind of thing. This is how we kind of like sustain consumer spending beyond what you would get from efficient wages in an efficient labor market, that kind of thing. Yeah.
Yeah, but this brings me back to my original point, is this coming from a journal like the MIT Technology Review, it makes sense. But I'm just questioning the entire premise of why we need incessant productivity growth. Here, they're lamenting that the growth is not as high as they would expect. There's still growth.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that we don't. I think generally speaking, we would want, all else being equal, assuming it doesn't hurt anyone, doesn't harm the environment or something, it's good to have more output, because then people are getting more stuff, and that's great. But that doesn't mean that more output is always what we want, because there could be consequences to that we don't want.
Right.
And in terms of productivity per hour worked, how much production per hour worked, I don't think that's something we should care about at all.
Right. I mean, I guess you could imagine, like, if you value people's time, like I was saying before, then even if you want to keep output the same, you might want things to get more efficient so people don't have to work as hard or as long and that kind of thing.
That's true. I want to say that beyond a certain level, I actually think more stuff makes people less happy.
Yeah.
So this is like a fundamental premise of capitalism.
It depends on how we define stuff. If we define stuff as things that benefit people, then it makes them happier.
Well, yeah, but that's not how capitalism works.
You're saying that people are buying things that don't make them happy, which
absolutely.
I think is accurate.
Well, at $75,000, happiness from more money.
Yeah, I mean that's
whoever
invented that statistic.
It's diminishing returns. Yeah. It's diminishing returns at every point. It just starts to become even more diminishing at a certain point. Yeah. That's kind of a different point about do people actually make good decisions for themselves, which I guess is partly a philosophical debate too. Because in a way, people are choosing to buy the stuff, right? But then there's this question of
that's just human nature. The way that we grew up. For thousands of years ago.
Yeah.
There are always scarce resources,
right.
Literally scarce resources.
Yeah.
So
there can also be other shifts in outside of economic models culturally in terms of what people decide to spend their time and money on, including is it more health oriented things like classes, or an art class probably maybe makes someone happier, maybe doesn't, than a TV or bigger, I don't really know. But there's different things that are that are all counted as output. But might not be the same for...
So my sense is that while things like basic income is certainly a big share of contributing potentially to people's happiness, we should just be questioning the premise of making our economic decisions based on these GDP metrics that have proven throughout the past 100 years not to work properly.
And not just questioning them, but asking ourselves, how can we align economic output with what actually does make people better off? How do we get it so that people, when they do spend their money, they're spending their money on things that actually do make them happier?
Right.
Like it feels like there's some kind of flaw there. So if we could address that problem, then output might more accurately represent things that make people better off as well.
I think there's a lot of factors there, but I guess one thing that wouldn't hurt is people having more time. I mean,
Right.
I'm not saying that to solve it immediately, but when people have more time, they can reflect and they can think more about what they want to do with their life and take on different philosophies of minimalism or whatever. People go. The people who do tend to reflect more tend to be the people with more freedom and more time.
Yeah.
I'm not saying that's a panacea, and most people with time are still going to buy a lot of stuff that doesn't make them happy. But the value of human time seems to also, be important for potentially steering people in that direction.
And I like that you're bringing up time, because one of my big problems with this labor productivity statistic is, and I brought this up a few times earlier, is just that we're defining what's labor and what's not based on are you being paid enough for it to be minimum wage, for it to count as a job, that kind of thing. And if we just think of people spending their time how they want to spend their time, and then the labor market is a market for getting them to do something else if you want them to do something else, there doesn't have to be this clear dividing line between what's labor and what's not. And then statistics like labor productivity, labor isn't like this, we've artificially made it this lump thing, there's X amount of labor and it's based on, how many hours worked there are, and how many hours worked is defined by, people spending time at whatever activity we've defined to be a job based on, being paid and having a labor contract and that kind of thing. It's not necessary. Yeah.
Right. And I think to your point, one of the reasons people might be turning to buying more stuff is we've kind of set up the economy such that for most people it's actually difficult. It can be difficult to trade money for time. Some people with flexible jobs can do it, can buy their time with money, but a lot of people have to work a certain amount to get healthcare, to get their whole stuff. It's an all or nothing kind of thing, right? And so you can't so you can get more money and thus buy more stuff, but you can't necessarily get more money and then work 35 hours a week instead of 40 hours a week.
Definitely.
It's sort of artificially constrained in this weird way. So maybe people turn to stuff, as opposed to other things that bring more happiness. And it might even feed back into the culture not focusing, even just this whole idea of productivity is focused on output, even though technically you could think of it as focused on people working less. People aren't necessarily working as hard to reduce the number of working hours as they are to increase the amount of stuff.
Yeah.
And so it's very much in the way that we're organizing things.
Yeah, I wholeheartedly agree with you. And I think one of the big reasons why this happened, the way that this current system is the way that it is not to be all leftist, but it's because it's very profitable for the corporations to have it that way, so that people are able to buy a lot of stuff, and then the only thing that they can do with their excess is money, perhaps, that they can spend by consuming
I think it's
more.
both though, because I also think it's the fact that we expect people to get their income from their job, and for some reason we have a certain amount of time that we think is legitimate to work, and we've decided on 40 hours a week, and that's partly because of labor movements and stuff like that too. And some of it's not efficient for the corporation. So I think you're right, but I also think there's more to it culturally in terms of why we can't just have people working.
Right, and I think everyone's responding to incentives, right? And that includes the corporations. So why is it that certain things are profitable and other things aren't? And that's economic policy. Makes it profitable to borrow money and start a business that maybe isn't very good because they want to create more jobs. That kind of thing.
But Rome is also right that I guess you can't really make money as a company from me spending more time with my family or something as easily as by me buying more clothes or something like that.
Yeah, that's right.
I mean, that's kind of part of your point, right? Yeah.
But you could make money as a company potentially by providing a service that doesn't necessarily use up any natural resources or anything like that. And that could be, that would count toward output, even though it's not, a physical piece of junk that you're making people buy or something like that. Yeah.
In Japan, they actually have a friend rental service or something. So you can actually get more time with your friends if you pay them. More money.
Is it counted as labor?
I don't know. Probably.
Yeah.
I've seen this. I've seen it in the U.S.
And also like parent rentals or whatever, and things like that.
How it's not just like babysitting them,
Not babies.
like for adults to rent parents.
Yeah, for
like fake
For
parents.
themselves?
For themselves or to show off to other people.
Because they want to feel better about themselves because their parents reject them or something.
Ah, so these people provide like the parenting that they never had.
And
I feel like there's an underlying problem
there's
with
also,
these.
there's also a trend in the U.S. where they get there's adult adoptions where they pick their successful parent to adopt them or something like that, and then they inherit their money or something. I don't really know.
Oh wow.
Wow.
Cool. So like parents who don't have a child and
Mhm.
they
Yeah.
adopt.
Oh, that makes sense.
Yeah, that does make sense.
Yeah.
And they can
Right.
yeah. When I was reading about the Rent a Friend in the US, he was saying that he ended up being rented for people confessing things that they felt they couldn't tell anyone about, or for people pretending that like it was their boyfriend or something
yeah.
like that with their parents, like kind of like acting.
Yeah, in China there's what is it? Spinsters, if you're like 25, so they go home with these with a boyfriend or a girlfriend or whatever to meet their parents, so
that their parents
so they can buy more time or whatever to
Right.
find someone.
so that their parents don't put too much pressure on them
Mhm.
to. Yeah.
All right.
Right.
So that's some labor that could be increasing happiness. I don't know how that speaks
Yeah.
to your point.
Anyone have any more comments before we get to another quote from the article?
Oh, we have quotes in the article.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, that was just the first
They're
one.
not up on the screen, so
I know.
I forget about
They're
that.
down on the screen.
Yeah.
Productivity growth in most of the world's rich countries has been dismal since around 2004. Especially vexing is the sluggish pace of what economists call total factor productivity, the part that accounts for the contribution of innovation and technology. In a time of Facebook, smartphones, self-driving cars, and computers that can beat a person at just about any board game, how can the key economic measure of technological progress be so pathetic? Economists have tagged this the productivity paradox. Yeah.
Okay, and that makes me think of like again other domains where we might expect to see more. So with the housework, I don't know lately if we've had a lot of like we have Roomba or something, but with housework, has the amount of time spent on housework gone down commensurate with the technology, like more in line with what people might expect from from productivity as relates to technological improvement?
I mean, housework, I think,
2005?
or just in the last whatever amount of time you want to
so housework, I think, is a pretty labor-intensive task. You know, if you're not factoring in.
Yeah, but I guess my point is
yeah.
like the problems we've listed that might create the productivity paradox. I don't think they apply to housework and technology, right?
The problems?
Yeah, like the reason that you wouldn't see as much gain for the technology as you might expect, like the wages are constrained, people are forced to work longer.
Yeah.
That doesn't apply to you doing your own housework. Nobody's forcing you to work a certain amount of time on
You doing your own housework?
Yes.
That's
you're
not
doing your own
labor.
Housework. Yes, I know. I'm trying to.
Okay.
Okay, I'm trying to say, unlike with paid labor and
Yes.
like output,
Right.
you might also expect that as technology gets better, that helps us do our housework. Our
Sure.
housework gets more efficient.
Yeah, like
And so
the invention of the washing machine.
And it doesn't have the kinds of constraints on that efficiency gain that other kinds of productivity have, as we've been discussing. So do we see, in the case of our own housework, the quote-unquote expected or correct amount of efficiency gain per technology in a way that we don't see with the
Yeah, I think we probably do.
Those
Like,
technologies that you pointed to aren't the ones that can vacuum your house, right? Like Facebook.
No, and I don't know if those are like recent ones, but I guess
You
I'm
haven't
saying
tried
like
Facebook lately.
when there is, we haven't really had great innovations
Yeah.
for housework for a while, but at certain points we did have them.
Well,
and
we have the
it's-
robot, right? But
We have
Yeah.
we have Roomba now, and
so
like
you're
Yeah.
fine with it scratching your floors.
But I mean,
and there's
everybody
a-
used to spend hours
Exactly,
upon
that's what I'm
hours
saying,
washing
yeah.
clothes by
Right.
hand,
totally, yeah,
diapers. Every day was spent in intensive labor.
right,
And
totally.
then the washing machine came in, and then we had the vacuum cleaner,
And the
then
dishwasher,
dishwasher. Those
yeah.
were huge labor-saving.
Totally.
devices.
Yeah.
Huge.
Yeah.
So Bethany, I think you're right. I think
Yeah,
you're not.
that's
You're,
what I'm trying to say.
I think
yeah.
we're probably not going to see this problem in housework. I think the only issue in like just doing your own housework. I think the only issue is that we haven't like all those innovations were more than 20 years ago. Except for
we
maybe
had some
Roomba.
good
If you wanted to scratch your
Yeah.
floors, you can use that.
Like Roomba.
There's actually a robot that can clean your bathroom.
Oh, yeah, I saw that.
Mm-hmm. They
Post
like
it.
sprays the wall, the
Yeah.
bathtub
Yeah,
and
that's
whatever,
cool. Yeah.
and like uses a scrubber. And,
Right.
So I
Yeah.
think he might be right for housework. Like maybe we haven't really seen the next
You can like
generation.
rent it or something
That's
maybe.
the point he's
So-
making.
So I
There's
think-
a delay
I-
in how this gets deployed, and
Right.
that's been the point
So
all
I
along.
think my expectation is that for these kinds of things, we will see the results kind of right away. We won't
That's
see
what
these
I'm trying
kinds
to
of
say. So
delays.
I'm trying
Yeah,
to put it forth as a contrast
yeah, I
where
like
you
it.
take away some of the constraints that we've been talking about and you do see the appropriate amount of increase in efficiency from them.
Yeah.
So I'm just really curious what productivity gains they expected from Facebook.
Yeah.
What productivity
I'm
gains?
really curious.
I don't know. It's more like
It should be negative.
Yeah.
it's more like the
Well, it is
argument.
negative, but I'm curious what they expected.
Right, what did they expect?
I think it's more like the argument, like, oh, we put a man on the moon. Why can't we do blah blah blah? Like we've
Right.
created this wondrous technology. Why haven't we?
I think that
I think it's less
if
about
you were to measure
expecting.
the right things,
Yeah.
like if you measured the number of people who read or learn about or like hear in some way something that I communicate, like that's
Yeah.
exponentially increased, right? Like from before the internet to now with internet and smartphones, like the number, like you'd have
Yeah,
to
I
pick
mean,
the right
internet,
measure.
but Facebook.
That's not really. I don't know if that's productivity.
Well, it's
but
not. It's not really
spreading of
contributing to
ideas.
economic
Yeah.
output. Per
Right.
se. Yeah, Richard,
actually,
go ahead.
Facebook can increase economic output. I sent you a video about that yesterday. If you can have put out advertisements catered to the person, and so they buy something like the baby sling or whatever, and then and that because someone posted a baby picture and they clicked and you click like or whatever, and so you receive a
Right.
baby sling picture, a baby sling that has your school logo on it or whatever, like they had in the video, and then so you buy that and give it to your friend, and then they.
So do we think that increases economic output, or just gets people to spend their money on certain things?
Well, I think that your point might be that like if people only
Yeah.
have so much money to spend, then that can help them spend it better. So maybe they're happier with their purchase, but it
Maybe.
wouldn't necessarily allow them to spend more because they don't have more.
Well, they do
money.
spend more, and
Right.
that does contribute to the whole package. I mean, that's consumer
Yeah.
spending, right?
Yeah. So maybe if they're saving less and spending more because of that, then you would see economic output go up.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's more to Roma's point about people buying things.
Well, and to
Yeah.
your point about the internet, I think they have it. They have an interesting way of framing this. It's a technology that allows other technologies for higher productivity. They frame AI like that,
Right.
but the way that they frame AI actually speaks to the unrealistic expectations. They say, "Oh, AI can enable you to produce more efficient solar panels." It's like, yeah, in theory.
Right.
In theory, somehow, very indirectly, maybe like 10
Actually-
years down the line, but
No, actually-
immediately it's just an enabler of potentially some way that we can do things better.
Actually,
Potentially.
there already is AI that can produce drugs by testing hundreds of different compounds, either virtually or by actually like using pipettes and things and testing it that way. Or they can go through like research from decades ago and finding different things
Yeah,
that
so
people miss.
I think there are examples of where technology has provided, more efficiency, and the technology is there, and then there are examples where it's not.
Yeah.
Yeah, Nick.
Well, I was just going to say that I think it is a real thing. I mean, you seem to be saying that we should, like, why wouldn't we see the gains right away? I mean, I think there are some things where you have to, the technology advances incrementally, and then you hit some threshold, like, self-driving trucks aren't putting truck drivers out of business,
Yeah.
out of jobs yet,
Right.
but
Yeah.
Yeah.
but it does seem like we're making progress in that direction. And if it happens in 5 years, it won't be because 5 years from now somebody invents something. It'll be,
Yeah.
30 years of
Acceptance,
progress
too,
towards that.
acceptance of
And the
it.
sensors and the software
Yeah.
and
Yeah, of course.
the economies of scale. And then you really might see like millions of people lose their jobs
Yeah.
Well,
over
So I
some
think
period
You
of
might
time.
see-
I think this would apply to things it depends on where they're getting their expectations from, I guess. Like if they're expecting productivity from self-driving cars to be here now, they're just getting it
Yeah.
wrong. So that's kind of why I was trying to ask, like, what
Right.
is the expectation based on?
I mean, I think that's a good concrete example
Yeah.
of one of the places where, AI or whatever you want to
Yeah.
call these technological advances could have a big impact on productivity
Right.
by decreasing the denominator.
Totally.
But it doesn't. But it doesn't necessarily happen smoothly.
Yeah,
Right.
I agree, and maybe this is anecdotal, but maybe what we're seeing now instead is more people participating in the gig economy, which is actually labor intensive, like Uber, Lyft, all of these.
Right, low productivity.
Amazon Mechanical Turk, like all of these like high labor intensive processes
Right. And like
that are actually driven by algorithms, but they require people to do mind numbing work.
And to your point, like maybe the advantage of that, if there is one, is like convenience, or people don't have to buy their own car, but that's not really showing up in output increasing. Like the output of Uber doesn't show up in the output calculation. Or I guess people are spending more money maybe, but maybe they're spending it instead of on a car, so it just like switches from one to the other.
Or instead of on a taxi or something. Yeah.
Or the numerator is going up, but the denominator is going up faster, right?
Right.
People are spending a lot of time driving their cars around.
Yeah.
So I mean, I think I think Nick, you're right that a lot of times it takes a while for technology to take hold, and then actually you actually see the effects of it. I don't think that's the problem that people are having with the productivity paradox. I think they're more wondering, why hasn't the technology that we already have, that we already know works, why hasn't it had the effect on the economy that we thought it would have in terms of increasing productivity, right? And I think, the answer to that is the same answer to why, when we do switch over to self-driving trucks, it's not going to destroy jobs. I mean, it might destroy those specific jobs, but in aggregate in the economy, we adjust, we compensate using economic policy to create jobs elsewhere. Not because we need that labor, but because we need to keep people employed.
But with self-driving cars,
unless we have universal basic income.
But with self-driving trucks, the truck drivers no longer need to go to the hotel or the truck stop or whatever. So those people in the restaurants or whatever lose their jobs. So then you have to either pay them a basic income or make work for them to do.
Yeah, maybe you just pay them to be in the truck and not do anything. Just keep on.
That counts as make work. Hey, we're going to pay you to drive this truck. You don't have to do anything, but we do want you to spend some of your money at this truck stop.
Just sit there. Piloting isn't exactly like this, but a lot of piloting is like this now. Actually, I mean, it's still very important to have the pilot there, I've heard, but you do have a lot of autopilot.
Yeah.
That's not exactly your point, because I think they are still needed there for some aspects of it. But.
So I mean, I don't think we're going to run out of our capacity for make work.
Never shall we ever.
No. Yeah. And I mean, you even hear about this politically, like with the federal jobs guarantee that some people talk about. Bernie Sanders talks about it, that kind of thing. That is not. It's not going to go away unless we do something about it. Yeah. And it's what would continue to fuel this kind of productivity paradox, right? Like imagine a future we have self-driving trucks.
Right.
There's still just as many jobs because we have a jobs guarantee, right?
Well, not if the collapse comes in the next 2 years.
Well, I mean, if the jobs guarantee is there, then
there won't be a jobs guarantee if the collapse comes.
You don't think so?
No, I don't think so.
I think a lot of people argue that.
I think it'd be more likely.
Yeah.
Everyone's going to be like, oh, we need.
Because everyone's going to be like,
we lost our jobs.
Tanks.
The dollar? Why is the dollar going to tank?
If the international financial community loses confidence in the dollar.
Yeah, I'm not worried about that. Mm-hmm. I think we could have another collapse like 2008, but the dollar was fine in 2008, and we'd have to really do something. Like I don't think we're like on a trajectory for the dollar collapsing. I think we'd really have to change course and screw something up in order for that.
It's a real possibility.
Well, you're talking about with Trump appointing new people.
No, I'm just talking about rise of China and other countries decreasing their kind of trying to find
petrodollar anymore.
Trying to find an alternative to the dollar as a reserve currency, and given our debt levels and slow down in the economy, it's possible.
I don't think. No, I don't think so.
That's fine.
That's a separate point.
It's an interesting thought. I mean, if our currency collapsed, then there's a lot of things we couldn't do, including a job guarantee.
A lot. Yep.
Yeah. Well, we could guarantee people jobs. We just wouldn't be able to really
pay them very much or something. Yeah.
Or anything, I don't know. Yeah. You guys ready for another quote?
Yep.
Yeah. Some argue that it's because today's technologies are not nearly as impressive as we think. The leading proponent of that view, Northwestern University economist Robert Gordon, contends that compared with the breakthroughs like indoor plumbing and the electric motor, today's advances are small and of limited benefit. Yeah, I don't think that's right.
I mean, it depends on what you mean by benefit, I guess.
Well, I mean, we can, I guess, define it pretty precisely, which is increasing economic output per hour of labor.
Because part of this is like the issue that we're talking about, where like some of the benefits don't go into output, or like aren't things you spend money on.
Well, I think the example of
Right.
how much, like which has a bigger impact on your life, like your washing machine or your Roomba. Like the Roomba looks kind of stupid.
The Roomba does look stupid, yeah.
Washing machine.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I think some of this is right. Like, I think the nitrogen innovation with farming, there were like a few things that made way bigger difference than the things that we're seeing now. In terms of like, I forget, there was like, I think a thing with nitrogen or
the Green Revolution.
About being able to feed like exponentially more people with the same farming in
I
the
mean,
same place and the same soil. That kind of thing is like much more important than AI arguably.
I mean, all of that is fine, but it doesn't explain why today's technologies are not nearly as impressive as we think. Like, are we just overestimating the technologies,
this is what I keep wondering, because you never really explained, or like I don't know if there is an explanation for like where the if it's a paradox, it's because it's low. It is like it's lower than expected, but like where are the expectations coming from?
Right. So I think I think the expectations are coming from looking at the actual technologies and looking at them in isolation and looking at how much more productive they do make workers who are using the technology.
So you think that those estimates are approximately right?
Yeah, I think they are, and I think they're wondering why that effect does not aggregate across the entire economy.
Yeah.
I think it has to do with what I said in the beginning of labor participation. Instead of being 63%, it's been lowered to 56%, and yet we're producing the same amount of stuff.
Well, I think labor participation right now is like 62.9.
No, but I read an article today that they revised it to 56%.
What?
That's what it's in Bloomberg.
That's like a huge difference.
So that's our productivity going up right there.
Yeah, there you go.
People participating.
Well, in any case, the official number is like 95% employment.
Oh yeah,
that's the unemployment rate.
Yeah. He's talking about labor participation.
Yeah,
which is
but
different.
but the real number, if you look into it, is not anywhere near to 4% unemployment.
Right. I think that's what he's talking about with labor participation.
Yeah, that's what I mean.
Yeah.
That's what the Bloomberg article I posted on the Automated Economy. It's one of the first articles they posted today.
This is big news for us.
Yeah, I mean, are you saying the Bureau of Labor Statistics is changing their the way they measure it, or
I don't know. That's what they said in the article.
The chocolate light, he doesn't care about that.
Yeah.
That's news.
Yeah,
that's news
that's
to me.
important news.
The chocolate light is very important. Yeah.
If I were going to interrupt the meeting in the middle to look.
I better start hoarding
the chocolate light?
Yeah.
Why don't you look up the chocolate light? Well, I look up the labor force participation rate.
Oh my gosh, yeah. They better figure out that synthetic.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, if it went from 62.9 last month to 56 or something this month, that's like.
They changed their way of measuring it.
They've changed their way of measuring it.
Yeah.
They haven't, it's not like something fundamental changed in the economy between last month and this month.
Oh, and also I read an article where we don't have the tools to deal with a regional recession, which is happening in the area Trump won last time with the Rust Belt or whatever. And so we could use a basic income to prop up the middle.
Let me see. Crisis looms for chocolate due to mysterious blight. This is all bad.
No.
They don't even understand the blight. They can't fix it.
The same is happening with bananas.
Whoa.
Oh.
Yeah, they
What
can.
happened with bananas?
No, it happened in the 60s, and then they found a replacement.
Yeah, so they had like the
Chocolate.
Big Mike bananas, and they all died in the 60s, and now we have the Cavendish, and they're all dying, I think.
They're all dying.
Yeah.
Oh wait, the bananas are also dying?
Yeah.
Yes.
Hey, we'll come up with a new banana. So I don't know. Back to productivity paradox.
Oh, this is actually worse than just sorry, go ahead.
Did anyone have any thoughts before we move on to the next quote?
I can move on to the next quote.
Okay.
It's just that the rainforest is also getting cut down, which is even more serious than chocolate because they're expanding.
Oh yeah, you didn't hear about that? Yeah. Yeah. So here's the next one. Others think productivity is in fact increasing, but we simply don't know how to measure things like the value delivered by Google and Facebook, particularly when many of the benefits are free. So I mean, that's right that we're getting a lot of benefits that aren't measured in economic output, and productivity of economic output, but that doesn't mean that. I mean, there's value that's not being captured in that statistic, but that doesn't mean that statistic isn't capturing something that it's supposed to be capturing.
Like the AI ads thing for the baby sling I mentioned earlier.
Right. And I don't think this explains, again, it doesn't really explain why technologies are not as impressive as we think. It explains why certain things don't factor into economic output, which we already weren't expecting them to factor into economic output. We weren't expecting the free Facebook to factor into economic output, I don't think. Yeah.
I just want to say that if we had a basic income, chocolate might not get solved as quickly.
Why?
Because one of the reasons they're mobilizing and taking it seriously is because a lot of people's incomes depend on the chocolate sales. This is a silly point. I obviously don't want them to be at the mercy of the chocolate blight.
Yeah.
I'm just pointing out that.
So if we had a basic income, we would let the chocolate blight rage on, but maybe we wouldn't burn down the Amazon rainforest as much.
I mean, that would be net good, yeah. People would starve.
There's another example. Yeah. If there are people like with wasabi in Japan, they're actually finding ways to create not artificial, but better ways to like grow wasabi in like greenhouses or whatever, they can do something like that with chocolate, maybe.
That's true. I mean, I'm just joking. And there'll still be a lot of profit.
And there's also like truffles as well, which only grow in the roots of like oak trees or whatever. Maybe they can find ways to, do it
somewhere else. Yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah.
Let me mention something that David Graeber mentions in some other writing, that he says that actually technology is improving in leaps and bounds like usual, except it's just in places that the government and the powerful want, specifically the defense industry and finance technology, in particular the amazing technologies behind high frequency trading, and in big data in general. Including Google and Facebook, but also the NSA, that these really are, moonshot level improvements in technology. It's just that they're not aimed at the people anymore.
So I think that's right. I think there are certain incentives and certain profit motives that get people to innovate faster, innovate more. I think that's right. I think that's different from the question of why are the technologies we have not having the effect that we think they are going to have.
Well, David Graeber says that they just haven't gotten the government push, AI
to be invested into.
Robots in the factory hasn't gotten the same kind of government push that, for instance, attack drones have gotten, and they really have improved. For 10 years.
I think that's right, but I think that's more of an explanation for why we're not necessarily getting or developing certain technologies. It's not as much of an explanation for why the technologies that we do have and we are using are not having the aggregate effect on the economy that we were expecting them to have. Yeah. But I do think there's room for improvement here. We could be investing more in innovation.
What technology are they referring to specifically that they thought that it would have more of a productivity gain? Because it seems a bit ephemeral.
It does seem a bit ephemeral.
That too,
Yeah, I mean, I think just software efficiency, that kind of stuff. There's all kinds of like labor-saving things that we come up with that. You would think if all you're thinking about is that we have a certain amount of labor and then we have, spreadsheets and databases and everything that's multiplying that labor, you might be confused that effect is not propagating throughout the economy.
Yeah, nothing in those fields with respect to software and databases has changed in the last 15 to 17 years. Almost.
So that might be an explanation.
Yeah, I'm wondering what software inventions. Yeah, it's the same question.
And then it gets back to what Nick is saying, which I
Yeah.
agree with, is that for the AI stuff to really take hold, we're not there yet. It takes a lot of time.
So I mean, you could be right that maybe we're not using technology or we would expect to make us more productive. I think that could be right, but I also know that it's not the whole story. I know that we could be a lot more productive than we are because of this whole thing where we're trying to keep everyone employed.
Yeah.
But I think you might be right that maybe it's also less than it has been in the past. Richard.
Well, actually, just yesterday, the FAA approved UPS to fly drones that can carry weight higher than 55 pounds out of the line of sight, so that increases the productivity of deliveries of things, and they can in Africa years ago they were delivering blood and things like that because the roads were so rotten, and so they're doing similar things to that in the U.S. and so they're working on deliveries into people's backyards and things like that, and so you don't have to drive all the way over to using all this gasoline or whatever. And there's also a company called Nightscope, which has security guards that you can have one security guard looking at all these cameras in one place and secure all these different television screens or something, and the robot goes and patrols all over the place. So and you only have one security guard where before you could have a dozen or more.
Okay. So yeah, I mean, so maybe you're saying those are examples of
Productivity gain.
yeah. The thing is, they're not things that are widely deployed. So for productivity paradox, I would think kind of to Roma's point, it should be something that everybody's using this now. Why are we not seeing more productivity in the economy? That's kind of more productivity.
But I guess I am kind of wondering what specific things. I'm thinking email. Email can help you communicate faster in a company, but it can also help you waste more time when you're sitting at your job.
Sure.
So it might help to have some of these concrete examples of what are they.
Well, email productivity gains should already have been factored in to the early part of their chart.
Oh, I see. Right.
Because
yeah.
email has not, the gains from email, which for sure did occur. Well, I don't know. I'm
or
just
being
assuming.
able to research information on the internet.
Yeah, that has already
companies
existed for
or
15 plus
Right.
years.
Right. So good question.
So-
What are the
So I think
what are the innovations?
just to take email as an example, because you were bringing up that people can also waste time on email.
Right.
So the question isn't, there's a lot of technologies that can allow us to do more, but also can allow us to waste more time.
Right.
The puzzle there is, why are companies hiring people who are using these technologies to waste time?
Right.
And I think that speaks more to kind of,
But one thing about computer stuff, this is very specific, but it is across the whole economy, is it's a lot harder unless you actually put spyware onto the computer.
it's harder to
actually
observe.
tell
Yeah.
whether the worker is working or not. And so imagine no computer, maybe it's harder to get away with reading a book or something like that.
Yeah.
But if you're on the computer, you can read a book, you can do anything on the computer, and they don't
there
know.
was a lot of spyware.
Yeah.
in
Yeah,
offices,
so now there
and
probably
they
is,
put it in
but-
a while
yeah.
ago, actually.
Oh, did they
Yeah.
really? Because a lot of the people I've talked
Taylorism,
to
that's what it's called.
who work in offices still spend a ton of time on Amazon and other things. And I don't know.
Oh,
if
Yeah,
that
I think a
possible.
lot of companies don't. Also.
Yeah,
Probably a
and-
lot of companies do, but a lot of
Yeah.
companies also don't.
Right.
These were all computer companies that I worked for, so maybe
But
that's what
it's not just the question of being able to monitor people directly. It's also the question of, even if you don't know what someone's doing specifically with their amount of time, how well they're doing at getting their tasks done.
Totally. I agree.
Um,
And that's a good
yeah.
question.
Oh.
And why don't other people get promoted ahead of them and then they want to do more?
Or why don't the companies that aren't very good at weeding out the the
Why
distracted
don't they go out of
workers, why don't they go out of
business?
business,
So
that
I
kind of
guess
thing.
it-
Yeah.
Well, I think they do. There are different kind of tiers of companies. Maybe the
Right.
ones that are kind of semi-subsidized.
Yeah.
Like, for example, my mom works for the MTA in New York. It's like a quasi-governmental organization in which there's a ton of waste.
Yeah.
And like her job is probably like that.
Yeah, that makes sense. Richard?
There's actually
Love you, Mom.
actually there's you can a person can waste a bunch of time and like outsource to like China or something, where the person is like paid an eighth of what they are, and then they can get the wages of like 4 companies for not doing actually anything and just outsourcing all these places. That's actually what's happening in some places.
Yeah, I'm not surprised.
But the point, actually, the second part of my thought is that, but then there are all of these other like tech companies and corporate America where, I mean, it is a meritocracy, and yeah, maybe they're
Right.
not tracking you because they don't really care what you do. If you get things done, then you move up the hierarchy, and if you don't, it doesn't matter if you didn't waste any time.
Totally.
Yeah. And I think
Nobody cares.
that makes sense, and that actually sounds pretty efficient to me as well.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Like to some extent, academia is like that. Like nobody really tracks how much time you spend, but eventually, like you either do stuff or you don't do stuff.
Right. Yeah.
Vaguely.
Okay. Let's do another one.
So all is not bad with capitalism.
So both views probably misconstrue what is actually going on.
Both views being.
Yeah. What are those?
The two views are the views that
Technology's not that good, and
right.
measuring the benefits.
Technology is not that good, or we're not
measuring
measuring
the
the
benefits.
accurately measuring the benefits. So both views probably misconstrue what's actually going on. I think I agree with that to a large extent. It's likely that many new technologies are used to simply replace workers and not create new tasks and occupations. What's more, the technologies that could have the most impact are not widely used. Driverless vehicles, for instance, are still not on most roads. Robots are rather dumb and remain rare outside of manufacturing, and AI is mysterious for most companies. So I'm going to say which part I agree with, which is that many new technologies are used to simply replace workers and not to create new tasks and occupations. And I think in the sense that the new technologies are not kind of generating more output, because output is constrained by consumers. It's not constrained by how much productive capacity we have. I think that's right. I don't think the new technologies are being used to create new tasks and occupations either. This is implying that they're not being used to create more productive tasks and occupations. I would say that we're using economic policy to create tasks and occupations that are not necessarily productive for people.
Oh, and
Yeah,
there's
Bethany.
Go ahead.
and there's also like tariffs. There were import restrictions or whatever on steel or aluminum, and so we're creating all these worthless jobs for
Yeah.
like it's the job like a steel worker can cost $80,000, but we're only paying them like $50,000 to produce steel, but it costs $80,000 to create the job for the steel worker.
Oh, I see. So we're spending money on forcing American workers to produce the steel.
Mhm.
Yeah, that's great. Did you have a comment, Bethany?
I guess I was just wondering what he was thinking about with the first part of that, like where
Yeah.
where it's displacing people. Is he thinking along the same lines that you think, which is that then those incomes aren't going to be able to go to people and thus not being able to go to output? Or,
I don't think he's thinking that big picture. I think he's thinking that I don't know. It's a little bit weird because if you just replace workers and the workers are gone, that's an increase in productivity, right?
that's what I mean. So
Yeah.
I wondered kind of what he meant.
Yeah, I mean, I think maybe he's conflating output with productivity or something in this part of it. Yeah, I don't know. What do you guys think?
I don't know. That's what I asked.
So we can read.
Or I mean, I didn't read it. I don't know, but maybe those workers are being displaced, and now, but they're still working because they still need to get by, and so they're driving Uber full time.
So more like what Alex was saying about we always have to
Lower
find jobs for them
productivity, yeah.
somewhere,
Yeah.
or lower productivity jobs. Yeah.
I mean, the
I'm
way
more confused about the second part, which is that technology being used to create more jobs.
Yeah, so
And I
so
can-
let me read the sentence again
Yeah.
so it's fresh in everybody's mind. It's likely that many new technologies are used to simply replace workers and not create new tasks and occupations.
Okay. Is
So
that-
the way I interpret this is as an explanation for why output hasn't gone up.
Right.
So he's making a few assumptions. So one assumption is that new tasks and occupations will be productive. If the technology created them, then it would lead to higher output. So he's saying that the technologies are replacing existing workers, so the output is the same. There's no, no change in output. But the labor that is saved is not being reallocated somewhere else to boost output further. So I think he's talking about output. He's not talking about productivity here, and he may have switched over from talking about one to talking about the other without making a clear distinction. Right.
I guess I wasn't making a clear distinction either. I mean, I've
Yeah,
been
that
thinking
seems
about it
So-
as
confusing.
output.
So output is how much stuff we produce.
Right, but that's part of the productivity.
Productivity is how much stuff we produce per hour worked.
But if it's displacing workers, then that
Yeah.
would increase productivity.
That's what I'm
I
saying.
don't understand
Yeah.
why.
He's not talking about productivity, he's talking about output.
But then that's a very bad mistake to make.
He thinks he's talking about productivity. And maybe he thinks he's talking about productivity because he's thinking of output as the numerator of the productivity equation.
And he's thinking the denominator is kind of fixed.
Well, that's what I'm
Right,
wondering. Is
yeah.
he
Right,
assuming that it's
like
fixed in some way?
Employment is pretty much constant.
Which is
Yeah.
kind of maybe what you're saying.
Maybe
is
he
that we
is.
find something else for them to do that's not productive. But
I mean-
if he was thinking it through, he'd have to think that through. Like, oh,
Right.
they're going and doing something, but it's not productive, or it's not as productive, like it's
Right.
Uber or
Right.
something like
So that's kind of my perspective. I don't know if he's really made that connection or if he's just kind of like intuitively not thinking about what that denominator is
I'm
in this particular paragraph.
unsatisfied with this sentence.
Okay.
But I share that. But I think that he's hoping that the technology, or I think that the contradiction is that is because he's expecting a big change in productivity,
Right.
which you can only get by a big increase in the numerator.
Yeah.
Right. He's hoping that, the technology would do one of two things. It would keep the same people employed in the same things, and they'd just be producing a lot more stuff, or it would. Yeah, I mean, I think that's the main thing. Yeah.
That's kind of what he wants to see happen.
Or what he's expecting, at least, or
Yeah.
what he thinks people should be expecting.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
And he's saying, well, if that's not happening, then the workers are just going somewhere else and.
Producing stuff somewhere else.
Yeah,
I mean,
We need this guy here.
Yeah.
Well, I was not going to say producing something somewhere else. I was going to say not being productive wherever they go.
I know.
Yeah.
I know, but I was thinking that it could be the other way too.
I don't think it is the other way. I mean, I think this is accurate that they're going somewhere else and doing something less productive than the job they left that became a lot more productive. This is the Balmos cost disease thing again. But, yeah.
Okay. Phew, it's quite a paradox.
It's quite a paradox. I mean, I don't think it's that much of a paradox. I think, it's only a paradox. Well, it's only a paradox because we're expecting this certain thing, right? We're expecting technology to improve labor productivity.
No, I wasn't really expecting that.
Well, then it's not a paradox for you either.
Is it really? I mean,
You're fine.
Isn't it
Yeah, I'm fine.
expectation? Isn't it just based on looking at the historical productivity growth and saying, like, why should it be like it used to be 4% and now it's almost 0? Why would it go down? I mean, is it really based on going through and saying, like, oh, like the latest version of Excel should be multiplying the productivity of Excel users by 10% next year, right?
Yeah.
So I think
And then
that's
adding that up over every.
Yeah.
I think that's a
Technology?
good point,
Yeah.
Nick. I think it is largely based on historical trends of productivity increasing over time and then it's slowing down.
Right.
And we actually saw there was kind of the productivity paradox first got brought up in like the 1980s.
Yeah.
People were talking about it then, and then the 90s happened, and we were very productive, and then it went back down again, or the productivity growth
I
went
think
back
you're
down
on
again.
something
Wait,
with this
really?
Excel thing. According to this chart, the highest productivity growth was in 2002, which is probably, it took 5 years for people to understand how to use macros. And then thereafter, it just started to go down.
So good question. Since the 90s, I'm kind of with Roma. Like, I'm not sure there have been that many things that have increased productivity.
You mean that would be expected to?
Yeah, that would be expected
Yeah.
to. Like the 90s is when people got the internet and computers and stuff.
I don't know. We didn't have smartphones until.
I wouldn't expect smartphones to, because you were in your office with your computer. Smartphones just mostly allow you to take your computer other places than.
Well, there are a lot of jobs that aren't in your office at a computer, right? What about those jobs?
Well, those weren't necessarily jobs focused on computer things, or you would have been in your office on a computer. I don't know. Maybe.
Well, they could have been jobs that required you being in a specific place, being like on site somewhere, or that kind of thing.
Yeah, I just wouldn't have had the strong expectation. Again, your smartphone could also distract you, or it's not really clear that.
But again, we get into the.
I know, okay,
yeah.
but it's. I guess
Right.
I'm still I guess the fact that it went up in the 90s and then slowed down is suggestive to me that the kinds of technology actually are part of what's going on. Because in the 90s we had the internet, and then we haven't really had anything that strong since then. In my view, that would have expected to increase productivity as much.
Okay.
So that seems like legit in terms of what he's saying.
Okay.
By the way, this article is a year old. It may
Who
have
knows?
just
We could be-
skyrocketed.
Yeah.
But
I don't
also
think so.
Alex, that like you're
Yeah.
making some important points that kind of stand independent of the productivity paradox, or what we
Right.
expect and what we see, because you're saying that like you can't maximize productivity if you're not giving people enough money to take advantage, and if you're forcing people to work no matter what. And that could have been true for the entire time that these trends are happening, Nick. Like the whole time, we
Right.
could have been limiting ourselves. Like it could have been supposed to be 10% and it was 4%, and so.
I think
So
that's,
I think your
that's
point
definitely
is,
right.
is
Yeah.
like true, because it's just like it's a theoretical point, independent of what we've seen.
Right.
And that's why I was trying to come up with these other examples like housework, or like other, where you don't see those kinds of constraints, and do we see, and it's hard to really compare, but do we see something different?
Yeah. Maybe if we look back at something like the washing machine, when that technology first hit, and then we look at other technologies that are maybe more directly involved in the labor force, and make comparisons
It's
there,
kinda
or
hard
something
to
like
do,
that.
but yeah.
But I like this point. I think it's a good point.
Yeah. But maybe some of like the little vacillations, because your point, your description of things has been consistent. So some of the vacillations up and down might have to do with like the kinds of technology being invented.
Yeah, and it could also just have to do with economic policies changing too, right?
Okay.
Or maybe in the 90s the stock market was booming, and money was easy to get, and therefore people had more money to spend on buying things.
That was independent
not
of their labor or something.
Yeah, it might. A lot of these trends or things that happened might not have to do that much with technological advancement
That's true.
as well.
That's true.
Yeah. Yeah, Richard.
It could be something like going from the hoe to the oxen pulling the plow into the tractor, or something like that. You could be increasing productivity with mechanization, so we're using typewriters, and then we're using these like Macintosh computer in like the 80s, and then we're doing this using the internet and things to do that, and now we're using AI to actually write articles for reporters, and
Yeah. So I'm going to read a few comments from here, and then I want to get people's final thoughts. So Sultan is on here. Hi, Sultan.
Hi, Sultan.
She says, I think the internet is the most important invention for the 20th century. It affected the economy a lot. I think that's right. And then Mitchell says that he agrees, and that one example is us being on here. Yes, we couldn't do this without the internet. So there's just a few more comments on here. Michael says, doesn't intellectual property slow down the increase of productivity of technology and development of new tech? I would say it slows down innovation and slows down the development of new technology. I don't think it necessarily slows, in the sense that it's restricted and you're not necessarily allowed to use existing technologies that someone holds the rights to. That would slow down the use of that technology as well.
There
Yeah.
are two examples,
Uh,
like 3D printers
so-
and the Da Vinci, like.
Yeah, I think we should wrap up here. I'm gonna go around and get people's final thoughts on the productivity paradox. Go ahead, Will.
It's an interesting discussion. I think that reaches beyond what the author of the article intended for us to think about.
Right. Steve.
I think as far as productivity in general, workers don't want productivity to increase because, as in Richard's examples, they generally lose a bunch of jobs. So there's sort of that pressure to not increase productivity, and it also, as Richard mentioned, maybe in the time period involved, the invention was not a new gadget. The invention was have China make it, because the business person doesn't care. The bottom line for the business person is, can they make more stuff cheaper?
Right.
And whether that's with robots or not doesn't matter to him. And if they can get it made cheaper in China, then that solves the business person's problem, regardless of the productivity.
Yep.
I think I remain skeptical of your explanation, Alex. And I think probably that the technology will catch up and that the productivity will reflect that. I think we don't yet know how to use certain things. Apply AI, apply, like sorting through medical records, for just one example. Figuring out how to coordinate all of these operations that are far-flung. I mean, we do some of that now, but we can do a lot more of that. And inventions that we have that are not being applied will make a big difference. I think he's right about that.
So you think that the technology will catch up even if we spend a lot of money paying people to dig holes and fill them back in again?
Yes.
Okay,
I
Richard.
do.
Well, there was an example of, the government providing subsidies to like oil companies to create all these jobs, but then during the recession, they implemented all these these automated technologies and things like that, increase the output of the oil wells, and getting rid of all these workers. And so when recessions happen, resources are constrained. So technology, the output, have the same output, you have to apply all these new technologies. So we just need to have another recession or something like that before there's enough of an incentive to implement these technologies.
Okay, Bethany.
I guess what I'm thinking through now is whether the things that you talked about, the limitation on people's money supply and forcing people to work a certain amount, are kind of constants. And hence, whether we still should see that if there's a particularly good kind of technology coming along, we see a relative increase in productivity, and if there's less technology, we see less increase in productivity. Whether we should still see those effects within a kind of baseline of being held back a bit by the things that you're talking about, or whether that would somehow not be the case. But it seems like it would be.
Yeah. Nick.
It's a good discussion. I don't know, nothing particular.
Okay. So, I guess, so Mitchell says thanks for the discussion, as does Sultan. To kind of Bethany's point, I think if, to the extent that output is always going to be constrained by people's income, and employment is always going to be determined by the fact that we want people to have jobs, technology is going to have no effect on how productive we are. Now, obviously, it's not true that it has no effect, but I think, depending on what our economic policy is at various times, it's going to get really hard to figure out how much of the effect is from technological advancement or not, and that kind of thing. Yeah.
So then you would explain fluctuations more with economic policy or something.
I think it's really complicated and hard to do. I think once we have a basic income in place that's calibrated to the productive capacity of the economy, it'll be really easy to measure the effects of technology on economic output.
Like your regression blog post with the...
Yeah. All All right. Thanks, guys.
Thanks,
Thanks,
Alex.
everyone. Good discussion.
Bye.
Bye. Bye, Sultan. Glad you could join us.